Davin Orell had been sitting on examination tables since he was 7 years old, which was the age at which the Accord's colonial medical program had determined that children in frontier settlements required annual biological assessments, and which was also the age at which Davin had developed the specific, practiced patience of someone who understood that medical procedures took as long as they took, and that restlessness did not accelerate them. He had received the standard contractor health assessment at 11 different stations across 12 years of structural cartography work. He had learned to bring something to read. He had not brought anything to read today because the transit from Heth Station had been delayed, and he had arrived at Accord Station Myerth's medical bay 20 minutes later than scheduled, and had not had time to stop at the contractor services desk. And so he was sitting on the examination table with the patient, absorbed attention of someone who had nothing to do, and was watching the assessment proceed with the quality of attention he usually applied to the environments he was mapping. The medical bay was on level 4 of Myerth's residential wing, which the original construction survey filed at the station's completion would have documented as a standard medical facility with a capacity of 12 concurrent patients and a staff complement of 8. Davin had read the original survey on the transit from Heth because reading station surveys was how he prepared for cartography contracts, and because the original survey was publicly available in the Accord's infrastructure database, and because reading surveys was the kind of thing that made the transit pass usefully. The original survey's documentation of Level 4 was 11 years old, which was 11 years of modification, renovation, and the specific architectural drift that stations accumulated when their operational needs evolved faster than their documentation. The actual Level 4 was probably not what the original survey described. He had noted 3 discrepancies between the survey and the observed reality in the 40 meters of corridor between the transit elevator and the medical bay's entrance. The physician who had been assigned to his assessment was Dr. Selavine, whose Accord staff profile listed her subspecialty as xenobiology and comparative genetic medicine, and whose manner had the quality of someone who found the work genuinely interesting. She had read his contractor profile before he arrived. She had mentioned this when she introduced herself, in the way of someone noting that they had done preparation, which was a professional quality he associated with good outcomes. She had been moving through the assessment standard categories with the efficient, attentive quality of someone who was looking at the data rather than checking it, which was the distinction that separated physicians who found anomalies from physicians who found only what the protocol expected to find. The assessment was going smoothly. Metabolic baseline normal, immune function normal, neurological profile normal. The display above the examination table, which had been cycling through the assessment's categories with the steady rhythm of a correctly running procedure, stopped at genetic baseline. Dr. Veen's hands stopped. The data interface's read cursor, which had been moving across the scan output, stopped. Everything stopped for 11 seconds. Davin counted because elapsed time was a professional habit and because 11 seconds was long enough to notice and not long enough to understand. "This can't be possible," she said. The translation caller rendered it from Delvari in the flat, accurate way of a system that translated words without their weight, but the weight was visible in the quality of her stillness, which was not the stillness of a physician managing a finding, but the stillness of a person managing something that the finding had produced in them. She looked at the scan data. She looked at him. She looked at the scan data again in the way of someone who has read a measurement and cannot reconcile the measurement with the category of things that are true, and is reading it again to confirm that it is. "Mr. Orell," she said, in the voice of a physician managing something significant, "I'm going to need to run a secondary scan. The primary may have produced an artifact." He looked at the stop display. He looked at her. "Was it the genetic baseline?" he said. She looked at him with the professional neutrality recalibrating itself. "What makes you ask that?" "The scan stopped at the genetic baseline category," he said. "And you said this can't be possible, which is not what physicians say when the metabolic baseline produces an artifact." A pause that was a recalibration completing. "Yes," she said, "it was the genetic baseline." She reached for the secondary scan equipment. "Please hold still." He held still for 40 minutes. The secondary scan equipment was more comprehensive than the primary. Its array extended further, its processing indicators ran longer, and the data interface that Dr. Veen was working at had the quality of someone reading deeply rather than checking. She had opened additional windows on the interface alongside the scan output, which he could not read from the examination table, but that he could see had the visual profile of database queries rather than clinical reference material. He did not ask questions. He had learned in 12 years of structural cartography and the specific patients it built that the most useful thing you could do while something was being understood was to stay out of the way of the understanding. She found whatever she was looking for in the 41st minute. He could tell because the interface's activity changed. The database query windows resolved to a result, and she looked at the result with the quality of someone who had been hoping the result would be different and had just confirmed that it was not. She looked at it for a moment that was longer than the 11 seconds and different in quality, not the stop of surprise, but the stop of someone making a decision in the presence of a confirmed finding. She crossed the examination room. She turned off the data interface's remote uplink, a deliberate action, not an accident, requiring the specific navigation of the interface's settings menu that you did not accidentally perform. She turned it off, and then she sat in the physician's chair at the examination table's side, which was not the formal delivery position, but the position of someone who had decided that what was happening in this room was not a delivery. "Your medical data is not transmitting to the station record," she said. "I have disconnected the uplink. I will tell you why I have done this before I tell you what the scans show, because the order of that information matters." He looked at the turned-off interface. He looked at her. "The order matters," he said, "because if you tell me what the scans show first, I might report it myself before I understand why that would be a problem." She looked at him with the quality of a recalibration completing at a different level than the previous one. "Yes," she said, "exactly that." She told him about the Verath archive. She told him about the Preth. She told him about 60 years of Cedar hypothesis research and the 3 factions that had formed around it. And she told him all of it before she told him what the scans showed, because she had said the order mattered, and she was a physician who did things in the order that she said they mattered in. He listened in the way he listened to structure briefings, following the architecture of it, mapping the load-bearing elements, distinguishing the surfaces that were weight-bearing from the surfaces that were decorative. The Xenobiology Research Program's 60-year hypothesis, the governmental consortium's 30-year parallel interest, the extractionist network's 15-year operation. 3 factions, 3 different relationships to the same information, and the information was in the local storage of a data interface in a medical bay on level 4 of Accord Station Myrth, and was, for the next 18 hours, not in the station's network. Then she told him what the scans showed. 99.4% concordance with the Preth genomic profile, the oldest entry in the Verath archive, 11 million years approximately, the precursor species, the cedar. He sat with this for a moment that was the kind of moment that required sitting with it. The specific, quiet work of integrating a piece of information that reconfigured the context it arrived into. He thought about the spaces he had spent 12 years mapping. The derelict stations, the abandoned installations, the built environments left behind by civilizations that were no longer in them. He had spent 12 years in the architecture of what civilizations left behind. And the most significant thing any civilization had apparently left behind was in his own genomic record. And he had been carrying it for 34 years without knowing it was there. "The 18 hours, he said, when the sitting with it had produced something useful. "What do you need in the 18 hours? "I need you to understand the architecture of the situation," she said, the word architecture. He noted it and filed it. "And then I need your help figuring out what to do about it." "I map spaces," he said. "I know how to understand an architecture." "I know," she said. "I read your contractor profile before the assessment." "Then you know I spend a lot of time in structures that most people consider too dangerous to enter." "Yes," she said. "That was the other reason I turned off the uplink before telling you. They worked. It was the kind of work that happened at a table. Not the examination table, but the physician's workstation, where he had pulled a chair and where they were both looking at the data that she was not transmitting and mapping what was possible in the space the 18 hours had created. He mapped it spatially, because spatial mapping was how his mind processed complex architecture. The 3 factions as territories with boundaries and access points, and the specific vulnerabilities that any territory had when its occupants had become confident about its perimeter. The research program's academic territory. Large, well-established, internally diverse, with the specific vulnerability of an institution that had been building toward a hypothesis for 60 years, and had developed, in 60 years, the specific institutional certainty that made it thorough and made it slow. The consortium's territory. Well-resourced, patient, with the specific vulnerability of an organization that had been funding something for 30 years on the assumption that it would eventually produce an asset, and that had not developed a protocol for the asset's appearance because the asset had not appeared. The extractionist network's territory. Smaller, faster, with the specific vulnerability of an organization that operated outside the framework and therefore could not use the framework's protections even when doing so would serve its purposes. She mapped it relationally, because relational mapping was how 9 years of research network work had built her understanding of it. The specific individuals whose interests were scientific, and the specific individuals whose interests were political, and the pathways between them, and the Accord's research ethics framework's provisions that no one had invoked in 40 years because no one had needed to invoke them. The pre-consent protocol emerged from her mapping at the end of the second hour, not as a solution she had prepared in advance, but as the solution that the mapping of the actual architecture produced. She explained its provisions with the precision of someone who had read them carefully and recently, and he listened with the precision of a cartographer who understood that the most important features of a structure were often the ones that looked like details. The veto authority, he said. It's complete, any research application. Any research application that the subject withholds consent for, she said. The protocol was written for recovered biological material and was written conservatively. Living subjects have rights that recovered material does not, and the protocol's drafters were conservative enough that they overprovisioned for the living subject case, even though they did not anticipate it. They overprovisioned, he said. They were thorough, she said, with the specific quality of a researcher appreciating thoroughness across the 40 years between the drafting and the present need. The consortium exclusion, he said. The external party provisions. Are they watertight? The provisions list the categories of external party that can receive data under the protocol, she said. Commercial interests and governmental bodies with a material interest in the data's application are excluded by the protocol's text. The consortium is a governmental body with a material interest in the data's application. She paused. It is excluded by the protocol's text. And the research program's receiving system will enforce the exclusion. The receiving system is automated. It enforces the protocol's provisions as written. The provisions exclude the consortium. The system will enforce the exclusion. She paused again. The system is not designed to be selectively enforced, which is why the consortium has not challenged the protocol's provisions in 40 years. The provisions are clear. The system is automated, and challenging automated systems produces documentation that the consortium would prefer not to have in the record. He looked at the mapping they had built across 2 hours. The architecture of it was becoming visible, the load-bearing elements and the decorative ones, the routes that were clear and the routes that were compromised, the specific gap between the extractionist network and the research ethics framework that the security officer's monitoring filled. The security officer, he said, the one you know, what do you tell them? The minimum necessary, she said. A contractor at Accord Station Meyerth has been identified as a potential target of the extractionist network. The network's interest is related to a medical finding that is under the pre-consent protocol's confidentiality provisions and cannot be further specified. The contractor requires monitoring. That's true, he said. It's entirely true, she said. It's also the minimum that is true. He looked at her. There's a difference between minimum true and incomplete true, he said. Yes, she said. The difference is whether the omitted information would change the action that the true information produces. The security officer's action, monitoring the extractionist network's interest in the contractor, is the same action whether or not the security officer knows why the network is interested. The omission doesn't change the action. It changes what the security officer might do with the information beyond the action, he said. Yes, she said, which is why it's minimum true and not complete true. She looked at him steadily. I have been a medical xenobiologist for 9 years. I understand the difference. I have made the calculation that minimum true is the responsible level of disclosure for this situation. He looked at the architecture of the situation as they had mapped it. He thought about what responsible meant in a structure this complicated, not the responsible of following the protocol, but the responsible of building a framework that held the weight it was carrying. "The consent documentation," he said. "I'll draft it with you. I know what I want to exclude." "What do you want to exclude?" "Invasive biological analysis," he said. "Any procedure that requires physical access to my biology beyond what standard medical assessment involves. Any research that does not have a defined clinical application." He paused. "And any analysis conducted for the purpose of identifying or locating what the preth distributed, as distinct from understanding what I carry." She looked at him. "The technology hypothesis," she said. "You're excluding research into the dormant technology sequences." "I'm excluding research into finding the technology," he said. "I'm not excluding research into understanding the biology. The biology is mine. The technology question is a different question, and I'm not consenting to be the instrument through which someone else answers it." She was quiet with this for a moment that had the quality of a physician receiving a patient's directive and assessing it against their own professional understanding. "The distinction is defensible," she said. "The protocol's provisions permit the subject to specify research scope with that level of granularity." "Then that's the scope," he said. They drafted the consent documentation across 4 hours. She knew the protocol's language and what the protocol's provisions required. He knew what he wanted the provisions to cover and what he wanted them to exclude, and the specificity of a structural cartographer's professional vocabulary produced documentation language that was precise in the way of things that needed to be precise to hold weight. The submission went through the academic channel at the 17th hour. The research program's receiving system processed it and generated an acknowledgement that confirmed the pre-consent protocol's provisions were active, which was the confirmation that the provisions were now part of the record and not addressable through informal channels. The consortium was excluded. The research scope was defined. The interface was Dr. Veen. The security officer's monitoring was established at the 16th hour through a communication that was brief and professional and produced, in response, a confirmation that was brief and professional, and that meant someone who understood the extractionist network's methods was now watching the station's relevant channels. The medical documentation completion report was filed at the 17th hour and a half. In the clinical language of a physician who knew how to document significant findings in the register, that the station's medical system was designed to process without generating alerts about findings that were under legitimate protocol protections. Dr. Veen wrote it with the specific precision of someone who had been writing clinical documentation for 9 years, and who was writing this particular documentation with the additional precision of someone for whom every word's accuracy was load-bearing. At the 18th hour, Davin sat in the medical bay and looked at the architecture of the situation as it currently stood. The data was in the research program's record under the pre-consent protocol's protections. The consortium was excluded by provisions that automated systems enforced without selectivity. The extractionist network was monitored by someone who knew what to monitor for. The medical record was complete and legitimate and not generating alerts. The structure was holding. He looked at Dr. Veen, who was in the physician's chair with the quality of someone who had been making difficult decisions for 18 hours, and was now in the specific moment after the decisions, which was the moment when you assessed what you had built and determined whether it was going to hold the weight it was intended to hold. "The preth," he said. "The research program is going to have questions about what the dormant sequences mean." "Many," she said. "The consent documentation specifies that questions are directed through me as the attending physician of record." "That's a significant professional commitment," he said. "My subspecialty is biological compatibility between species in shared environments," she said. "A confirmed preth descendant interfacing with the contemporary galaxy is the most significant biological compatibility question my subspecialty has ever had the opportunity to address." She paused. "The involvement is professionally appropriate." And beyond professionally appropriate. She looked at him with the long ears in the position he had been learning across 18 hours of working alongside her. The fully forward position of someone who was present with what they were saying and not managing the presence. "Beyond professionally appropriate," she said. "I turned off the uplink before I told you anything, which means I made a decision before I had your consent to make it, which is a decision that a physician makes when they have assessed the situation and determined that the patient's interests required protection before the patient could be consulted." She paused. "I would make the same decision again, I want you to know that." He looked at the examination table he had been sitting on when the display stopped cycling. He looked at the turned-off uplink. The interface was on again now, transmitting the legitimate documentation, but the physical gesture of turning it off before she said anything was not erased by the turning on. He looked at the physician's chair and the 18 hours and the mapping they had built together from two different kinds of professional knowledge. "The station survey," he said. "The structural cartography contract." 6 weeks, she said. "Your schedule has you reassigned after 6 weeks. The original survey is 11 years old," he said. "I counted 3 discrepancies between the survey and the observed architecture between the transit elevator and this room." 3, she said. "The actual interior architecture of a station that's been operationally modified for 11 years is significantly more complex than the documented architecture. A thorough survey takes as long as it takes." He looked at her. "The contract extension request process. Does the Accord's contractor services desk require a reason?" "Operational necessity," she said, "demonstrated by the discrepancy between the original survey and the observed conditions." "The discrepancies are demonstrable," he said. "I documented 3 of them on the walk from the elevator." She looked at him with the quality of the recalibration that had been occurring in increments across 18 hours. And that was arriving, at the 18th hour, at a result that the physician's professional framework had language for, and that the physician was present with beyond the professional framework. "The medical follow-up schedule," she said. "Field assessments are compatible with concurrent research protocols, as long as the research protocol lead is managing the interface." "The research protocol lead," he said, "that's you." "For as long as the research program has questions," she said, "which is going to be a long time." He looked at Accord Station Meyerth through the medical bay's viewport. Its corridors and levels, and 11 years of architectural drift. Its original survey inaccurate in ways that a thorough cartographer would need time to document correctly. He looked at the medical bay, which was on level 4, and which had been the room where the most significant finding of anyone's contractor health assessment in living memory had been processed with the specific care of 2 people who had spent 18 hours building a framework from the actual architecture, rather than the documented one. "The extension request," he said. "I'll file it in the morning." "The follow-up schedule," she said. "I'll build it around the survey work." He looked at her, she looked at him. The medical bay held them in the quiet of a room where the significant things had happened, and were now simply the condition of what came next. Outside the viewport, Accord Station Meyerth continued its business. The research program's receiving system had confirmed the pre-consent protocol's activation. The security officer's monitoring was in place. The consent documentation was in the record with the specificity of a structural cartographer and the precision of a medical xenobiologist, and the weight of 18 hours of building something from the actual architecture, rather than what the architecture was supposed to be. Somewhere in 11 million years of genomic record, the Preth had distributed something across the galaxy with the specific patience of a civilization that understood the difference between a timeline that was comfortable and a timeline that was adequate. The galaxy had been discovering what was distributed for 60 years. The discovering had taken on a new character in the past 18 hours, which was the character of a discovery being managed by the people it was discovering rather than by the people who wanted to use it. The bioluminescent growth on Verath Solis, where an alien princess had been awakening a dormant capacity in a botanist's northern sector, was a different kind of Preth distribution. The genomic sequences in a structural cartographer's baseline were another. The galaxy was full of what 11 million years of patient distribution had left, and the galaxy was still learning how to look at it. The 18 hours were over. The work was beginning. Neither of them was in any hurry because the things being mapped did not benefit from being rushed, and they had both learned this separately and were learning it again together, which was a different kind of learning and was, in the specific and honest accounting of what the 18 hours had produced, the most significant finding of the assessment. The physician's chair and the examination table were at the angle of people who had turned toward each other, and the survey extension request was going to be filed in the morning. And Accord Station Meyerth's actual architecture was significantly more complex than the 11-year-old documentation suggested, and the documentation of it was going to take as long as it took.